Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible and visible clearly? How are you doing? Okay, thank you. So, आज we will be discussing. It's not morning, it's afternoon. Shivani, are the notes up? Yes, I believe it's uploaded. It's good afternoon, right? So, once during the interview time, I had made this mistake. I entered the room at 12:01 and I said good morning to the interview board of the UPSC. And then after the interview, I realized that it's good afternoon now. So, is my voice fine, right? Because somebody is saying that it's echoing. The voice is fine, right? Okay. Okay. So, आज we will be discussing very important topics because यहाँ से questions आ रहे हैं. Twice a question has been asked from this topic. So, we will be discussing French Revolution, Napoleon's rise, and Italian and German unification. It's a very interesting story, especially the German unification. You'll know a lot about how the modern nation states arise. When we talk about Germany, when we talk about Italy, they were not the same 150 years ago, right? So let's start with French Revolution. I will discuss that in the end. I'll take 5 minutes where I'll address all your questions, right? So French Revolution, right? In the last lecture, we had discussed about Enlightenment, and we had also discussed how the French people, how the French, you can ask all your doubts in the end of the lecture. So basically, in the last lecture, how Enlightenment, was something that was prevalent in Europe, and it was very strong in France. All people, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, they were all French, right? So an intellectual movement was happening in France in the 18th century. And French Revolution, to an extent, is the consequence of that intellectual movement that had begun in Europe, especially in France. Therefore, French Revolution can be considered as the first major revolution of modern world in Europe. We saw American Revolution yesterday, but French Revolution had different reasons and it had different consequences. Okay? So if we talk about the French Revolution, before we talk about the French Revolution, let's understand what are the factors or what are the background behind the French Revolution. So सबसे पहले we start with social factors. We start with social factors. तो सबसे पहले we see कि जो यूरोप था या जो वर्ल्ड था, society was very much divided, right? तो अगर हम बात करें, okay, it's not going down. It's not going down. हाँ नीचे नहीं दिखा रहा हूँ इसी पे कितने कितने हाँ मतलब नीचे तो कर लूँगा अच्छा ठीक ठीक यार अगर आप कुछ नहीं बोले तो लॉक हो गया ठीक ओके ओके फाइन Okay, sorry, there was some technical error. So basically, if we talk about the French social structure, we see that the society of France was divided into three major estates or three major classes. We had the first state, which was the clergy, the second state, which is the monarchy and the nobles, and then we had the third state, which included all other people except the nobility and the monarchy and the clergy. ठीक है ना? तो ये जो third estate था, third estate had various groups. It had big businessmen, it had educated class, it had court officials, merchants, traders, lawyers, peasants, serfs, artisans, landless laborers, servants. तो जो almost 97%, almost जो आपकी 97% population थी, right? वो 97% population third estate में आती. और as you can see, the third state included a very different variety of people. It included people who were landless laborers, who were servants. It also included big businessmen and merchants who were very rich. But ultimately, they were treated same by the state. They were treated same by the first and second estate. So they had to pay the same taxes. Plus, even if you are a big businessman, even if you are a big merchant, you cannot expect to be part of nobility. Because nobility was based on birth. If you have a royal blood, only then you can be a noble. Only then you can be a high-ranking official in the court of King Louis XVI or his predecessors. So the kind of social mobility was absent in the French. And these people who had already become rich, they were the main pioneers of the French Revolution because they thought that ये कितना unfair system है. We have the money, but we cannot have a political power. We cannot have any kind of decision-making power. And even if we do anything in life, we cannot expect to be part of the first two states. So ये जो frustration था, especially among the middle class, because of this lack of social mobility, that was one of the most important reasons behind French Revolution. अब सोचो ना, मतलब आपको अपनी तकदीर पता है कि हम इसके आगे नहीं जा सकते. Even I become very rich, but still I have no say in the policies of the country. I have no say in the policies of the king. So you can understand how frustrating it can be for the third estate people. Okay? Second is economic causes. So as we have discussed in the last lecture, that French had participated in the American War of Independence, especially when they understood that the colonists have a good chance of winning. So because they have participated in the American War of Independence, and before that there was also 7-year war. 7-year war was fought between French and America, especially for the domination of the American region. ठीक है? अब we have understood yesterday also कि 7-year war की वजह से Britain की economic condition worsened significantly, and it had to impose a number of taxes on the colonies, which resulted in the American Revolution. Now French, who were also defeated, they also faced a lot of economic crisis because of the amount of money that they have spent on the war in which they were defeated. Right? But unlike the Britain, France did not have the option of imposing taxes also, because France was not ruling over any kind of territory. ठीक है ना? Plus the monarchy at that time in France was Louis XVI and his very infamous wife Marie Antoinette. And Marie Antoinette used to spend money like anything, and ultimately there was a very famous saying that when the women of Paris were protesting against the increase in the bread prices, she famously said that why don't these people eat cake? Because ultimately she was so much, or the royalty or the monarchy was so much away, and there was so much gap between them and the common people that they did not understand that it's not just the bread shortage, they don't have money to buy anything. Right? Now, second major economic cause was heavy taxation. The third estate thought it had to pay a lot of taxes. It had to pay 10% of their income. They have to pay as taxes, as we've understood. जो church को देते थे, उसके अलावा land tax, industry tax, commerce tax. There were various taxes they had to pay. And the nobles and the clergy, they were exempted from any kind of taxation. So usually when we see the modern taxation, what do we see? The rich, the rich pays the more tax. That's how it works in India and many other countries. And that's what we call as progressive taxation. कि जो जितना अमीर होगा, अब आप सोचो ऐसी सिचुएशन जहां पे एक आदमी जो रोड पे भीख मांग रहा है, जब रोड पे भीख मांग रहा है, वो टैक्स दे रहा है. और अगर आप देखो अंबानी को, अडानी को या और हमारे जो इंडस्ट्रियलिस्ट हैं, उनमें से कोई भी टैक्स नहीं दे रहे. तो सोचो जो आदमी रोड पे भीख मांग रहा है, उसको कितना बुरा लगेगा कि आई डोंट हैव मनी, आई एम ऑलमोस्ट स्टार्विंग and I am paying the tax. But somebody who is earning, who is living a life of luxury, he is not paying any tax. Right? Third very important economic cause was the feudal burdens on the peasantry. So as we know that feudalism was still prevalent in France. And in feudalism, as you know, the serfs were tied to land. And they had to pay, not the serfs, even the peasants who were not tied to land, they had to pay taxes to church, they had to pay taxes to their lords, and ultimately they had to pay taxes to the state or the central government. So there was this triple burden of taxation on peasantry, which made them impoverished, right? Fourthly, in 17 or in the second half of the 18th century, there were certain progressive, certain intelligent finance ministers who tried to bring reform. But every time the reform that they had tried to bring, it was vetoed by the aristocratic class, it was vetoed by the nobles. For example, we have three main examples. These were three finance ministers of France who actually saw the condition, and they realized that in order to improve the economy, we have to broaden our tax structure and we have to modernize the economy. But since nobles, they did not want any kind of their privilege to be stopped, they kind of vetoed their decision. For example, Turgot, who was the finance minister, he abolished forced labor, and he also provided, or he also decided ending the guilds. But ultimately, nobility opposed because they thought that they will lose their feudal privilege, and his decision was reversed. Secondly, Necker, he said that instead of imposing taxes, it's better to, take more loan because taxes will burden the people. And he also advised that the royal expenditure should be reduced. But again, the court aristocracy reversed his decision. And third was Calonne. Calonne said that there should be a universal land tax. Everybody should pay the tax, including the nobility. But again, his demand or his proposal was also rejected by the nobility class. So basically, whoever tried to improve the situation, it was these nobility class who had so much veto over the power that they were rejecting each and everything. Fourth was agrarian crisis in famine. There was a crop failure. 1787 and 1788, there was a crop failure that had led to hunger, famine, and it increased the prices of bread to a significant level, which resulted in bread riots in various parts of France because the price of bread had become very expensive. Similarly, so that these were the major economic causes behind French Revolution. Third was political and administrative, issues or causes. So, the ruler of France, Louis XVI, he was part of the Bourbon dynasty or Bourbon monarchy. And he was an absolute ruler. So there was no as such constitution. There was no kind of accountability. There was no assembly. Because in the meanwhile, in England, we had constitutional monarchy, where the king's power, after the Magna Carta, the king's power has been declining over the years. And in England, in Britain, you had a monarchy that was much more limited in its character, and it is bounded by the constitution. On the other hand, in France, there was absolute monarchy. The king had all the powers, he had no accountability, and people had no political rights. Meanwhile, you understand this thing, in France, in 18th century, all these great people, Montesquieu and Rousseau and Voltaire, they were talking about that they should be citizens, everyone should be citizens. At the same time, the actual condition in France was that there was a ruler and subject. People were not citizens, they were subjects of the ruler, and they had no political, economic or any other right. Similarly, what happened was, as I've told you, कि 18th century तक आते आते enlightenment का टाइम था, ट्रेड इंक्रीज हो रही थी, ठीक है, इंडस्ट्रियलाइजेशन धीरे धीरे आना स्टार्ट हो रहा था. So there was this class, prosperous class, which emerged in France. What we call as the bourgeois. Bourgeois means people who are capitalist. And these bourgeois class, they also demanded participation. कि भाई अब धीरे धीरे हमारे पास पैसा आ रहा है और हमारे पास आ रहा है पैसा, तो जाहिर सी बात है कि हमको हिस्सेदारी दो. Because without that, what is the point of being economically rich when you are politically so powerless? So they had demanded कि भाई अब जो है, जो किंग का कोट है, जो किंग की नोबेलिटी है, उसमें हमको भी इंक्लूड किया जाए. But जो ओल्ड नोबेलिटी थी, who were still tied to land, who were not doing any kind of business or production, they had denied any kind of participation to this emerging bourgeois class. ठीक है? Similarly, there was huge corruption at the court. The leadership was weak, because leadership is weak in a way that the finance ministers of the king were trying to bring reform, but every time it was being vetoed. It was bourgeois were technically the capitalists. They were mostly the early capitalists who were doing business, who were doing production, who were the traders. So they were mostly the rich businessmen. Okay. So ultimately, if we talk about if they would have been a strong king, वो क्या करता? वो अपने finance minister को support करता कि भाई आप लोग का बहुत हो गया, अगर अब हमने economy ठीक नहीं करी, तो we can face a serious crisis. But Louis XVI was a weak monarch. Despite his good, efficient ministers who were trying to bring reform, he sided with the nobles who were against any kind of reform. So because of that weakness also, because अगर शायद reform आगे होते 1780s में, तो शायद contribution नहीं होती. But the delay in reform, because of the inaction of the king, had made French Revolution inevitable. Fourth was intellectual influence or Enlightenment ideas. As we know that France was also the place where all these Enlightenment intellectuals were writing so many progressive ideas. Talking about republicanism, talking about separation of power, talking about popular sovereignty, talking about freedom of speech, right? And these ideas, because after the printing press, they started spreading these ideas. They used to write in newspapers, they used to write pamphlets. जो coffee shops थी वहाँ पे ये ideas discuss होते थे. तो French citizenry जो थी, वो कहीं ना कहीं they become काफी aware that okay, what we are getting is not a good deal. Ultimately, we should get more rights. So जो इन्होंने base बनाया था French intellectuals ने, वो base जो था उसने ensure किया कि at least जो urban center थे फ्रांस में, वहाँ पे एक educated और एक aware तबका पैदा हुआ, जो कहीं ना कहीं wanted reform, who wanted that this whole system should change. Fifth was the impact of American Revolution. So as we know that French participated on the sides of the colonists or the American in the War of Independence. And many French soldiers fought alongside the colonists against the British. And when they were fighting, they actually realized that these people are fighting for such a great idea of liberty. They are fighting for the idea of republicanism. They are fighting for the idea of Bill of Rights. And everything that they are fighting for is being denied to us. Because these soldiers were also, they were not part of the first or second state. They were part of the third state. They were also common people. Right? So ultimately, participation in the war had made them aware that ultimately we are fighting, we are doing this for the other people, but at back home, we are not getting the same rights. So when they went back home after the war, they were also one of the biggest supporters of the revolution. And then we talk about the immediate cause, which is the financial crisis. So there was almost a bankruptcy, by 1788. And finally, the king Louis XVI realized enough is enough. I think my every reform measure is being vetoed by these nobles. Let me call a state general's meeting. A state general क्या था? It was kind of a national assembly. It had 3 chairs. So first estate, as we have told you, nobles, first estate clergy, second estate lowers, and third estate was common people. So he called he conveyed the meeting of estate general after 175 years. 1614 में last में ये इस असेंबली की मीटिंग हुई थी. इसके बाद से कोई असेंबली कोई भी पार्लियामेंट फ्रांस में नहीं थी. तो दिस वाज देयर बट नो किंग हैड कॉल्ड फॉर दिस मीटिंग. इस एस्टेट जनरल की जब मीटिंग आई तो उस मीटिंग में क्या हुआ कि 3 estates were there. ठीक है ना। इसमें 3 लोग थे, पहले थे जो मैंने कहा क्लर्जी, नोबिलिटी एंड द कॉमन पीपल। अब हुआ क्या कि इस एस्टेट की मीटिंग में 2-3 चीजों पे डिस्प्यूट रहा, क्योंकि हर एक एस्टेट अपनी ग्रीवियंस के साथ गया था किंग के पास कि भाई हमारी क्लास के लोगों के साथ ये दिक्कत है, इसको सॉल्व करो। सेकंड स्टेट ने कहा हमारी क्लास के साथ ये दिक्कत है, इसको सॉल्व करो। एंड थर्ड स्टेट ने कहा हमारी ये दिक्कत है, ये रिफॉर्म्स लेके आओ। तो हुआ क्या कि डिस्प्यूट ये हुआ कि बोथ द स्टेट्स, फर्स्ट एंड सेकंड स्टेट सेड कि द वोटिंग ऑन द प्रपोजल, द रिफॉर्म प्रपोजल शुड हैपन थ्रू वन स्टेट वन वोट प्रिंसिपल, व्हिच मींस कि फर्स्ट एंड सेकंड स्टेट के 2 वोट हो जाएंगे और थर्ड स्टेट के 1 वोट होगा। So ultimately, whatever the first and second state will decide, that will be the decision. But this time, जो third state के लोग थे, वो they were determined. They said कि भाई बहुत हो गया, 170 साल बाद ये असेंबली बनाई गई है, and we are the people who are dominating that in terms of population. So they said कि नहीं, this rule we will not follow because this rule से कोई reform हो नहीं पाएगा. The voting should happen on the basis of numbers. तो जिस स्टेट में जितने नंबर ज्यादा होंगे, उस बेसिस पे वोटिंग होनी चाहिए, जो लोग मेजॉरिटी होंगे, that should be the decision that should be taken. Ultimately, the first and the second state declined this proposal of the third state. Third state ने कहा कि अब हमने ये हिम्मत मान ली है कि हम यहाँ से पीछे नहीं हटेंगे. So what they did was they assembled at a tennis court near the assembly. तो अगर हम बात करें तो असेंबली में टेनिस कोर्ट पे वो लोग असेंबल हुए एंड वहां पे असेंबल होके उन्होंने एक ओथ ली कि जब तक हम एक कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन नहीं बना लेंगे हम इस टेनिस कोर्ट से बाहर नहीं जाएंगे. एंड दैट वाज द बिगिनिंग ऑफ द फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन. द कॉमन पीपल विद लॉट ऑफ करेज डिसाइडेड कि भाई इनफ इज इनफ, नाउ वी विल टेक थिंग्स और वी विल कीप द मैटर इन आवर हैंड्स. तो सबसे पहले हम बात करते हैं फर्स्ट फेज ऑफ द फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन की, जिसमें जो मेजर बात थी वो थी स्टेट जनरल एंड कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल रेवोल्यूशन. तो बेसिकली क्या हुआ कि जब वो टेनिस कोर्ट में थे और वो वोट ले रहे थे, उसी टाइम पे क्या हुआ कि जो आम लोग थे उन्होंने बैस्टिल फ्रांस में एक जेल भी थी और वहां पे जो इंपीरियल आर्म्स थे वो भी रखे जाते थे. तो a group of mob from the third state, they had attacked Bastille, and by attacking the Bastille उन्होंने क्या किया कि जो वहां का गवर्नर था उसको मारा, they had killed him. Secondly, जितने भी वहां पे कैदी थे उनको रिहा किया गया, and thirdly जो आर्म्स थे वो आर्म्स भी लूट लिए. तो that storming of Bastille symbolize कि अब एक अनार्की का दौर आने वाला है, अब किंग का कंट्रोल धीरे धीरे खत्म होने वाला है. ठीक है. अब उसके बाद जब ये Bastille की स्टॉर्मिंग हुई तो क्या हुआ कि जो गांव में पेजेंट्स थे, there was a rumor that was spread कि भाई इसका बदला लेंगे नोबल. Nobles will start, nobles will start killing the peasants. So that kind of a rumor was spread in the villages, and that rumor is called as the Great Fear. भाई अब हमने जो एक्टिविटी करी है बैस्टिल में, उसके रिस्पॉन्स में ये नोबल कुछ तरह उल्टा सीधा हमारे साथ करें. तो what they started doing is कि गांव में peasants had started burning the books, जो कि लोन की बुक्स थी, ड्यूटीज की बुक्स थी, जो उनके लॉर्ड्स की बुक थी, उन बुक्स को उन्होंने, उन रिकॉर्ड्स को उन्होंने जलाना शुरू कर दिया कि इनको मालूम ही नहीं चलेगा कि एग्जैक्टली इन्होंने कितना लोन किसको दे रखा था और कितना टैक्स किससे वसूलना था. Secondly, they also started the burning of those houses of these lords or these feudal nobles. ठीक है ना? So that was the Great Fear. At the same time, 1789 में जो थर्ड स्टेट के लोग टेनिस कोर्ट में थे, उन्होंने अगस्त डिग्री और what we call as kind of a law वो पास किया. And August degree said that all the feudal privileges that are prevalent in France, they are being abolished. हम आज ये एक फैसला लेते हैं because they call themselves as National Assembly. जो थर्ड स्टेट थे उन्होंने अपने आप को नेशनल असेंबली डिक्लेयर किया. ठीक है. दैट वी आर द पार्लियामेंट ऑफ द कंट्री एंड वी विल डिसाइड और वी विल मेक लॉज फॉर द कंट्री. और इस नेशनल असेंबली ने अगस्त डिग्री निकाली जिसमें उन्होंने कहा कि ऑल फ्यूडल प्रिविलेजेस जो इतने सालों से मिल रहे थे विल बी अबॉलिश्ड, एवरीवन विल बी इक्वल इन द आईज ऑफ लॉ. अलोंग विद दैट they came up with this declaration of rights of men and citizens, and in this declaration they said that from now on in France there will be equality before law. Everybody is equal. You are a king, you are a noble, you are a, you are a clergy, you are a priest, you are equal before the law. Secondly, there will be popular sovereignty. It will be people who will decide law, what kind of laws will be made. So there will be a strong limit. And thirdly, every citizen has some natural rights, right? Like right to life, right to property, etc. So these were the declarations of rights of men and citizens जो उन्होंने अगस्त डिग्री में निकाली. ठीक है. इसके बाद क्या हुआ? So this is the tennis court, oath, and this is the storming of Bastille photos. उसके साथ साथ क्या हुआ कि जो पेरिस की वुमेन थी, so basically जो फ्रेंच monarch था, he and his wife used to live in Versailles. Versailles was the place where the monarch used to reside. Versailles was few kilometers away from Paris. So basically some angry women from Paris who were not getting the availability of bread because bread had become very expensive. They went to Versailles and they forced the monarch and his wife to come to Paris to see the situation. And ultimately they forcefully brought Louis XVI and his wife to Paris from Versailles. ठीक है ना? एंड दिस इज एग्जैक्टली अ ग्रेट शिफ्ट इन द रेवोल्यूशन, बिकॉज यहां से ये क्लियर हो गया कि अब जो रियल पावर है वो लोगों के हाथ में आ गई है और किंग की कहीं ना कहीं पावर जा रही है. Then we come to the second phase of this French Revolution, which we called as the phase of constitutional monarchy. The phase of constitutional monarchy. So ultimately, जो नेशनल असेंबली जो थर्ड स्टेट ने बनाई थी, उसने कुछ लॉज पास किए. पहला लॉ ये था, they passed civil constitution of the clergy. अब as you know that France was a Roman Catholic state, जहां पे चर्च के पास बहुत पावर्स थी, राइट, एंड बहुत सारे प्रिविलेजेस थे. सो दिस सिविल कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन ऑफ क्लर्जी में उन्होंने कहा कि जो चर्च के प्रिविलेजेस हैं, दैट विल बी अबॉलिश्ड. जो उनके पास सरप्लस लैंड है, right, that land will be kind of redistributed to the common people. And thirdly, the church and the clergy will have to take oath. They have to take oath of loyalty to the new French Republic, and all the clergy were made the state employees. तो उनकी जो excessive power थी, जो कि divine power थी, कहीं ना कहीं वो खत्म कर दी. Now this move had alienated a lot of devout Catholics in France, because almost half of these, they refused to take the oath of, ultimately for the new French state. अच्छा, इसी बीच क्या हो रहा था? इसी बीच किंग, जो कि पेरिस में बंद था, he was almost under the house arrest. किंग ने सोचा कि भाई ऐसे तो कुछ हो नहीं रहा, because किंग नो now he is powerless. He is technically, all the decisions are being taken by the National Assembly. तो किंग ने भागने का सोचा. So king and his wife, as servants, they actually secretly left the palace, and they were going to Varanus, right? Varanus is a town in the eastern part of France near the border, and they were assured कि वहां पे they will get some forces that are loyal to them. Using these forces, what these king and his wife will do, they will go to the neighboring country, and neighboring country में वो उनसे अपील करेंगे कि भाई आप भी monarch, हम भी monarch, अगर फ्रांस में रिपब्लिक बन गया तो अल्टीमेटली आपका भी नुकसान है और हमारा भी नुकसान है, तो हेल्प मी टू रीगेन द थ्रोन. बट अनफॉर्चुनेटली जब वो लोग उस शहर में पहुंचे तो वहां पे एक पर्सन ने, पोस्ट मास्टर ने, he identified king and his wife because he saw his photo on the coin, and he reported to the authority. Unfortunately, the king and his wife were arrested and they were taken back to the palace. अब जब वो पैलेस आए तो कहीं ना कहीं जो एक सिंपैथी थी, वो सिंपैथी उनके हाथ से चली गई. लोगों को लगा कि यार देखो, किंग, हमारा देश की हालत इतनी खराब है, इकोनॉमी इतनी खराब है, the only thing the king could thought is to run away from the country and side with the enemies. So that this single event destroyed the image of the king in the eyes of people. अब हुआ क्या कि इस फेज में जो नेशनल असेंबली थी, उन्होंने कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन बनाया, which is called as the Constitution of 1791. और इस कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में ये डिक्लेयर किया गया कि फ्रांस विल बी अ कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल France will be a constitutional monarchy, and in that constitutional monarchy there will be an elected legislative assembly. और उसको कौन elect करेंगे? All the property owning male citizens, right? तो जिन male citizens के पास property होगी वो elect करेंगे members of legislative assembly. King became a constitutional monarch. He will have a suspensive veto, but real executive power जो रहेगी वो king की cabinet के पास रहेगी, which will be elected by which will be selected by the legislative assembly. So this constitution of 1791 transformed France from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy. अब हुआ क्या कि जो उस समय नेशनल असेंबली में डोमिनेट कर रहे थे, उस ग्रुप को हम कहते हैं ज़ीरोदिन्स. They are called as ज़ीरोदिन्स. ये नाम याद रखना, it's an important thing. ज़ीरोदिन्स. Now these ज़ीरोदिन्स, they were basically people who were moderate in their approach. They were not in favor of a republic state. Republic means जहां पे कोई monarchy नहीं. जैसे India is a republic, UK is not a republic because UK में head of the state is the British Queen. ठीक है? तो these people, they thought कि यार इतनी पूरे देश में अनार्की चल रही है, in order to unite the people, it's important that the spirit of nationalism can be or should be invoked among the people. And the best way to invoke the feeling of nationalism is by attacking or by declaring war on some of our neighbors. Because जब war होगा तो everyone will become patriot. So ultimately war on Austria, right? But ultimately इस war में France, as you know, economy was already not doing well. So France was not prepared for the war, and France was facing reverses and defeats in the war. अब इससे हुआ क्या कि एक पूरा पैरानोया फैल गया कंट्री में. The Zerodins expected that this will unite the country, but this war has actually divided the country more because everybody started, treating the other person with suspicion. कि ये आदमी, informer है, ये आदमी enemy है. All this kind of paranoia, was there in France. कि भाई हर आदमी को लगता है कि दूसरा आदमी जो है is anti. Environment में नेशनलिज्म बहुत इंक्रीज हुआ, एंड ज़ीरोदिन्स who were more moderate, उनका डाउनफॉल होना स्टार्ट किया और राइज होना स्टार्ट किया एक और ग्रुप का जिसको हम कहते हैं जैकोबिन्स. राइट? सो अल्टीमेटली जैकोबिन्स बिकेम मोर डोमिनेंट इन दिस रेवोल्यूशनरी मूवमेंट. ठीक है ना? उसके बाद हम आते हैं थर्ड फेज में, एंड द थर्ड फेज इज रिपब्लिकन फेज. सेकंड फेज कौन सा था? कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल मोनार्की. ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन फ्रॉम एब्सोल्यूट टू कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल मोनार्की. द थर्ड फेज इज व्हाट वी कॉल एज द रिपब्लिकन फेज. बिकॉज क्या हुआ कि 1792 में अगस्त 10 a violent mob stormed the Tuileries Palace. मोनार्क और उनकी वाइफ रह रहे थे, and they had effectively ended the monarchy. खत्म हो गई. फ्रेंच उस समय फ्रांस में फिर इलेक्शन हुआ और उस इलेक्शन में एवरी इलेक्शन बेसिकली फ्रांस तो लेजिस्लेटिव असेंबली थी इलेक्शन में every male member, there was universal male suffrage. Every male member voted. Almost 33 lakh people voted in this election. And after this, what happened was, which was called the Parliament of France. Convention ने एक बार मत करेंगे, but now monarchy France abolished. Now France will take head of, there will be no more. और इस कन्वेंशन में डोमिनेंट वो था which was moderate voter of Constantine, वो उसका कहीं ना कहीं काम होने गया और Jacobins, which was the most radical group which lived in Republic French, complete anti-monarch, they had the dominant role in the new parliament, which is called the National Convention. So on this historic date of 21st September 1792, monarchy was abolished from France and France was transformed from constitutional monarchy to a republic. Right? Then we come to the fourth phase, or what we call as the reign of terror. If you can see this photo behind me, this is called as guillotine. Right? अब हुआ क्या कि 1793 में नेशनल कन्वेंशन ने एक 12 लोगों की कमिटी बनाई. They had created a committee of 12 people and they called it Committee of Public Safety. अब mind you, इस समय तक वॉर चल रहा था ऑलरेडी और एक बहुत ज्यादा चैलेंज में था फ्रांस क्योंकि वॉर चल रहा था. एवरीबडी वाज डाउटिंग एवरीवन, एवरीबडी थॉट कि द अदर पर्सन कुड बी एंटी रेवोल्यूशनरी. तो एक बहुत ही ज्यादा सस्पिशन वाला माहौल था और इस सस्पिशन वाले माहौल में इन 12 लोगों को एक्सट्रीम पावर दे दी गई, एक्सट्रीम एग्जीक्यूटिव पावर दी गई. they were kind of the wartime cabinet and the wartime cabinet was given with kind of an emergency power. They used to decide all the economic matters and military matters. And this committee was headed by a person called as Robespierre. And Robespierre and his friends started what we call as the reign of terror, in which anyone who is considered to be anti-revolutionary was. Take this photo, so you have this kind of this big knife that is there. So a person used to sit here and this guillotine, this knife used to go down and the person was beheaded. So many anti-revolutionaries or what we call perceived anti-revolutionaries were guillotined. 17,000 of them were guillotined during the reign of terror. And the most famous among them was Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. They were also guillotined by Robespierre and his team. This was the fourth phase. Basically हुआ क्या कि इस टाइम तक आते आते लोग परेशान हो गए because everybody thought कि because Robespierre not just guillotined common people but he also guillotined his closest allies and friends. So everybody was scared of Robespierre. So all of them assembled together and they launched the counter revolution against Robespierre. Robespierre was arrested and Robespierre was guillotined on 27th July 1794. And this is what we call as the Thermidorian reaction because जो revolutionary calendar बनाया था Committee of Public Safety. तो जुलाई मंथ जो था that was called as the Thermidorian. ठीक है? So that's why this term was called. So basically he was guillotined and the reign of terror was finally over. Then we come to the fifth phase which we call as the Directory phase. So basically क्या हुआ कि Robespierre and his associates were guillotined and ultimately the power was passed to what we call as Directory. Directory was a moderate Republican government जिसमें technically 5 लोग थे. All these 5 people were there. जो टेक्निकली एक दूसरे पे चेक्स एंड बैलेंस रखे हुए थे and these 5 people were running the government. Also it had a parliament and that parliament was or that legislative power was decided between two houses, the Council of 500 what we call as the lower house and the Council of Ancients that we call as the upper house. So this directory ruled for next 4 years or next 5 years between 1794 till 1799. ठीक है? अब अगर हम इस बात करें इस डायरेक्टरी की तो डायरेक्टरी में बहुत सारी प्रॉब्लम्स थी. सबसे मेन प्रॉब्लम थी कि there was political instability. They were continuously facing attacks from the Royalists and the Jacobins because they were moderate in nature. So they were hated both by the Royalists and also by the more radical Republicans we call as Jacobins. Similarly, there was a lot of corruption in the economy and the economic situation was very bad. There was inflation, there was unemployment, there was there was unavailability of crops, there was unavailability of bread, and finally they had to, since they were so weak, they had to depend on the military for order. And because of their dependence on military, they gave a lot of power to a person who later replaced them, and that person was Napoleon. So Napoleon cannot be considered as an integral part of French Revolution, but definitely, he emerged out of French Revolution, right? So that's how the French Revolution continued in 5 phases. पहले फेज में स्टेट जनरल की मीटिंग हुई और उन्होंने कहा कि हम कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन बनाएंगे. सेकंड फेज में कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल मोनार्की आई. थर्ड फेज में रिपब्लिकन फ्रांस आया. फोर्थ फेज में रेन ऑफ टेरर आया और फिफ्थ फेज वाज द टेरिटरी फेज. ठीक है. तो अल्टीमेटली 1799 में टेरिटरी वाज ओवरथ्रोन बाय नेपोलियन बोनापार्ट एंड थ्रू अ कूप. ठीक है. So if we talk about French Revolution, as I've told you, it was a significant event. Why? Because you cannot expect 10 years, 10 years ago, France was a very, very absolute monarchy. People had no power. In 10 years, people had all the powers. In fact, people had, it was the people who had all the powers. Right? Nobility lost all the powers. Judge lost all the powers. So it was a very significant event in this regard. But it had also had a number of weaknesses. And the biggest weakness was failure to ensure political stability. Even if you can abuse the king, the Louis XVI, but at least his institution provided political, stability to France. There was no anarchy. There was at least a system. But ultimately, French Revolution में क्या हुआ? Monarchy से mob rule आया. Mob rule से फिर military dictatorship आ गई under Napoleon. So there were the frequent changes, and with the frequent changes, it reflected that French Revolution was not able. French Revolution was not able to create a stable institution. ठीक है ना? Similarly, there was excessive violence and radicalism. Too much violence. There was too much violence. 17,000 people were guillotined. ठीक है ना? तो जो हम बात करी थी, जो फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन का मोटो था, लिबर्टी, इक्वालिटी एंड फ्रेटर्निटी. आपने लिबर्टी ली, आपने फ्रेटर्निटी भी खत्म करी. राइट. सिमिलरली, देयर वाज नेग्लेक्ट ऑफ इकोनॉमिक रिफॉर्म. इकोनॉमिक रिफॉर्म जो था, वो कहीं ना कहीं इट वाज नेग्लेक्टेड, बिकॉज इफ यू सी ड्यूरिंग द 10 years पीरियड, ब्रेड के प्राइसेस कम नहीं हुए, इन्फ्लेशन कम नहीं हुआ, ब्रेड की अवेलेबिलिटी नहीं हुई, न्यू एम्प्लॉयमेंट क्रिएट नहीं हुए, और बिकॉज ऑफ वॉर जो इंडस्ट्रीज थी वो भी नेगेटिवली सफर हुई. Similarly, there was exclusion of women and minorities. Understand this thing, that French Revolution was mostly led by the bourgeois class, the middle class, because it was the middle class who was educated. It was the middle class who was expecting more share in the power, because they had wealth and they were educated, they were aware, and they were influenced by the ideas of French philosophy. But ultimately, जो lower class था, वो ना ही बहुत ज्यादा इसका पार्टिसिपेट था और ना ही उसकी लाइफ में कुछ चेंज हुआ. बिकॉज इक्वालिटी के बाद भी आपने क्या किया? आपने टेक्निकली प्रॉपर्टी का बेसिस पे वोटिंग रखी. ठीक है. सिमिलरली, वुमेन कहां थी? देयर वाज वन सिग्निफिकेंट वुमेन और सिग्निफिकेंट फेमिनिस्ट व्हिच वाज ओलंपे दे गॉच. ओलंपे दे गॉच was a very, very important feminist who asked for more rights for women, and she also demanded that women should also have voting rights. But since she was a moderate and she was a believer in constitutional monarchy, she was executed by during the reign of terror. Yes, Anushka, they did not give any kind of suffrage to women. आपने आधी आबादी को छोड़ दिया, right? And you are saying that you are champions of liberty and equality. Similarly, there was from the beginning itself, there were internal divisions and factionalism. क्योंकि there were two main groups. One were the moderates or the Girondins who had advocated for constitutional monarchy, and you had Jacobins who were complete anarchists and radicals. तो डे वन से वो जो आइडिया था कि हमें बनना क्या है, वो आइडिया वाज कंफ्यूज्ड एंड देयर वाज ऑलवेज अ फाइट फॉर दैट आइडिया. Similarly, there was a rise of militarism and Napoleon. As we see that during the end of the French Revolution, ultimately it got replaced by a military dictator. तो वो जो बहुत ग्रैंड आइडिया था डेमोक्रेसी का, वो जो ग्रैंड आइडिया था राइट्स ऑफ पीपल का, वो कहीं ना कहीं अल्टीमेटली इट गॉट शैटर्ड विद द राइज ऑफ अ मिलिट्री डिक्टेटर. एंड फाइनली देयर वाज आल्सो शॉर्ट टर्म रिवर्सल ऑफ आइडियाज. वो हम बाद में बात करेंगे कि जब नेपोलियन आया तो बहुत सारे आइडियल जो फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन के वो कहीं ना कहीं बिखरे. नाउ लेट्स डिस्कस द इंपैक्ट ऑफ फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन. तो जब इंपैक्ट की बात करें तो मोस्टली 4 लेवल पे इंपैक्ट होता है: पॉलिटिकल, इकोनॉमिक, सोशल और ग्लोबल. व्हेन यू आर राइटिंग द आंसर इन ग्रीक एंड व्हेन यू आर डिस्कसिंग एनी रेवोल्यूशन, so if the question says impact, try करो when you're writing the answer इसको political, economic, social और global में break. तो political impact क्या था? End of absolute monarchy. Finally, जो divine right था बोर्बन डायनेस्टी का, कि हमको भगवान ने बोला है कि हमें यहाँ पर रूल करना है, that right was collapsed. Similarly, there was birth of modern democracy. At least elections were held, even though they were not perfect, but there was elections. There was at least men who were voting, and new terms like rule of law, equality before law, citizenship. उससे रेवोल्यूशन से पहले पीपल वर सब्जेक्ट्स, रेवोल्यूशन के बाद पीपल बिकेम सिटीजंस, एंड टर्म्स लाइक पॉपुलर सोवरेनिटी इमर्ज्ड. ठीक है. सिमिलरली देयर वाज आल्सो अ कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन, अ रिटन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन दैट वाज फ्रेम्ड. और फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन से इंस्पायर होके कई और यूरोपियन कंट्रीज ने, मोनार्कीज ने कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन बनाया. सेपरेशन ऑफ पावर की बात की गई, राइट. एंड फाइनली इट लेड टू द राइज ऑफ रिपब्लिकनिज्म, व्हिच मींस कि देयर कुड बी अ स्टेट दैट कैन एग्जिस्ट विदाउट अ मोनार्की, राइट. सो दिस आइडिया बिकेम सॉलिड इन यूरोप एंड लैटिन अमेरिका. Social impact. very important impact was abolition of feudalism. Because they have understood this in the beginning, कि how feudalism was a pre-existing feature of France. Understand this thing, कि आप कुछ भी कर लो लाइफ में, आप नोबल नहीं बन सकते हो, आप कुछ भी कर लो लाइफ में, आप किंग नहीं बन सकते हो, आप उस elite section में नहीं आ सकते हो, और because you were born in that third estate, you have to pay tax, you have to face discrimination all your life. This abolition of feudalism is some revolutionary thing done by the French Revolution. कि serfdom हटा दिया गया. अब जो peasants थे, they were not tied to land. They were free people. They can do whatever they want in life. They cannot be. They are no more almost the slaves of the landowner. Feudal dues जो थे, कि आप उनको extra pay करते होते थे. Privileges जो थे, they were abolished, and equality before law was emphasized by the French Revolution. Secondly, it also led to the emergence and empowerment of the bourgeois section, because many of the leaders of the French Revolution were from middle class. Thirdly, it led to the erosion of aristocracy and clergy power. They became equals. They lost their privileges that they got through birth, right? And finally, there was a emergence of a secular society. The role of church, the role of pope, that decreased, because ultimately now the bishops and the priests of the state, and जो उनको extra privileges मिले हुए थे, those privileges were abolished. Then economic impact की बात करें तो pope, we talk about priest. If we talk about economic impact, we see that it led to the end of feudal economic structures. So with the end of French Revolution, industrial revolution arose in France. There was also redistribution of land from church and nobles to common people. So a new property owning class emerged in France. And there was also fiscal reforms, like taxation was there. Banks were established. So that also had an economic impact. And finally, intellectual and ideological impact. New ideas came. For example, लेफ्ट राइट हम बात करते हैं, ये लेफ्ट विंग है, ये राइट विंग है, उसका आइडिया फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन से ही आया है. जब नेशनल असेंबली बनी थी, राइट, जो थर्ड स्टेट ने बनाई थी, तो इस नेशनल असेंबली में जो लोग लेफ्ट में बैठते थे, दे वांटेड अ रिपब्लिक स्टेट, दे वांटेड टू एंड कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल मोनार्की, दे वांटेड पॉपुलर सोवरेनिटी. जो लोग राइट में बैठते थे, दे वर बिलीवर्स ऑफ कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल मोनार्की, राइट. सो दैट्स हाउ द टर्म लेफ्ट एंड राइट अरोज. और अभी भी हम कहते हैं कि लेफ्ट इज कंसीडर्ड टू बी मोस्ट प्रोग्रेसिव एंड राइट इज कंसीडर्ड टू बी मोर कंजर्वेटिव. तो जो उसका ओरिजिन हुआ है वो टेक्निकली फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन से ही हुआ. ठीक है. सिमिलरली नेशनलिज्म वाज बॉर्न. Everybody believe that they are from French, right? Plus ultimately जो enlightenment ideas थे वो strengthen हुए. Religion का रोल कम हुआ, liberty का idea, fraternity का idea, equality का idea, ये idea strengthen हुआ with French Revolution. And if we talk about the global and international impact, so this French Revolution impacted many other revolutions, जैसे Latin America में Italian and German unification में भी इसने help किया. We will discuss how Indian nationalism को affect किया. राजा राम मोहन रॉय inspired हुए, right? Then there were people like Tipu Sultan who got inspired. Then it also led to spread of nationalism in other countries, because after the war, after the French Revolution, Napoleon, who extended the French rule to various parts of Europe, he spread the ideas of French Revolution to many countries which were ruled by him. Plus, it also had an impact of it also created a challenge to the monarchical Europe. एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव और लीगल इम्पैक्ट देखें तो वो नेपोलियन के थ्रू आया, बट वी विल डिस्कस दैट लेटर. इंडिया की बात करें तो इंडिया पे इसका काफी इम्पैक्ट आया. एज आई हैव टोल्ड यू दैट राजा राम मोहन रॉय took many progressive measures from the फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन. जो हमारा नेशनल मूवमेंट था उसमें जो हमारा, अगर आप देखोगे प्रियम्बल में कहीं ना कहीं जो आइडियाज हैं वो फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन से आए. लिबर्टी, इक्वालिटी, फ्रैटर्निटी, राइट, राइट्स ऑफ मेन, राइट, दे वर टेकन एंड दे आल्सो बिकेम इंपॉर्टेंट पिलर्स ऑफ आवर नेशनल मूवमेंट. हमारे नेशनलिस्ट लीडर्स थे, दे वर फाइटिंग फॉर दैट. ठीक है ना. सिमिलरली टीपू सुल्तान, ही आल्सो established a Jacobin club in his kingdom, and he also brought many progressive ideas from the French Revolution. ठीक है. Now let's talk about the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon की अगर हम बात करें, Napoleon was born in a small island south of France, close to Italy, called as Corsica. Tree of Liberty, yes. Corsica. Corsica is a small island, very beautiful island, near Italy and far from France. And in Corsica, the population was half French, or it was mostly Italian. Napoleon himself, belonged to a minor Italian nobility, but they did not have money. So in his early years, he lived a life of impoverishment. He did not have money. He lived a life of poverty. Right? When he was young, he was sent to a military school, and through that he joined the army of France. Okay. How did Napoleon became so powerful? You can see this map. This map, if you see, if I increase it further, if you see this map, this is the French Empire that was directly under the rule of France. ठीक है? If you see these green were the states who were under the Napoleon's control, which included Spain, Italy, Germany, and also Poland. So almost 60% of Europe was under Napoleon. Now, if you talk about this purple, these are technically the states that were allies. These were the states that were allies of Napoleon, right? If you see that, they were allies of Napoleon. Okay? So if you see the whole map of Europe, except UK, Russia, and Sweden, and Portugal, almost all the Europe was either under the direct or indirect control of Napoleon. That made Napoleon so powerful that ultimately पूरा का पूरा आप देख पा रहे हो कि empire was under the Napoleon. ठीक है ना? अब if we talk about rise of Napoleon, how did rise of how French Empire? Because later on Napoleon crowned himself as king. ठीक है? तो उसके बारे में हम अभी बात करेंगे. Napoleon crowned himself as king in 1804. He called himself as the Emperor of France. That is why he is also considered as someone who has destroyed the legacy of French Revolution. ठीक है? So how did the rise of Napoleon happen? So one very important factor was, we have discussed that just now, there was political instability after the French Revolution. Every 1-2 years, regime was changing. कभी Girondins हैं, कभी Jacobins आ गए, फिर Directory आ गई, right? And we have discussed how Directory that was in power between 1794 to 99, it was weak and corrupt. It was not able to manage the economy well, and it lacked any kind of popular legitimacy. And finally, it was dependent on the military for its survival. ठीक है ना? And as I've told you, Napoleon had joined the army in 1780s. Second was military background and revolutionary wars. As we know that France was under the war. French Revolution के बाद से ही France was facing a war with its neighbors. Similarly, as we know that Directory was a weak government, and since it was a weak government, they depended on military and its officers for its survival. And thirdly, आर्मी जो थी, देखो सारे इंस्टीट्यूशंस जो थे कहीं ना कहीं डिस्टेबलाइज हो रहे थे, बट आर्मी एक ऐसा इंस्टीट्यूशन था जो कि सबसे स्टेबल और सबसे ऑर्गेनाइज्ड इंस्टीट्यूशन था. क्यों? बिकॉज फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन ने क्या किया था? फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन ने प्रिविलेजेस बेस्ड ऑन बर्थ हटाए थे, तो मेरिट बिकेम द सोल क्राइटेरिया फॉर राइज. तो अल्टीमेटली वेरी एफिशिएंट मिलिट्री मैन अरोज इन 1790s फ्रांस. ठीक है ना? एंड नेपोलियन भी उन्हीं कुछ लोगों में था जो एक आम परिवार से आया था, लेकिन because of his efficiency that he shown in various battles and various crises which Directory was facing, that led to his rise. Because as you know कि अगर French Revolution नहीं हुआ होता तो somebody like Napoleon who came from a humble background, he could not get promoted to such a high rank in the army. ठीक है? Third was his early career break. तो 1793 में क्या हो रहा था? जब आपकी नेशनल कन्वेंशन की गवर्नमेंट थी, तो उस समय टूलन एक पोर्ट है फ्रांस में जहां पे रॉयलिस्ट जो थे दे हैड सीज कंट्रोल ऑफ दैट पोर्ट, एंड इट वाज अ वेरी स्ट्रेटेजिक पोर्ट फॉर फ्रांस. ब्रिटेन ने भी अपनी आर्मी भेज दी थी कि भाई दे विल हेल्प द रॉयलिस्ट टू इंश्योर दैट दे हैव कंट्रोल ओवर द पोर्ट. अब बेसिकली क्या हुआ? नेशनल कन्वेंशन ने नेपोलियन को भेजा टू फाइट अगेंस्ट दैट रॉयलिस्ट रेबल्स, एंड ही एक्चुअली डिड अ वेरी गुड जॉब. Within few days he actually defeated the royalists and took back Toulon under the French government. So this performance led to his promotion as brigadier general at the young age of 24 only, right? इसके अलावा royalist revolt हुआ था 1795 against the Directory. Royalists were the people who were supporters of the monarchy. Again, Napoleon was sent by the Directory, and he actually kind of defeated that revolt, and it saved Directory from overthrow. So because of that, he gained a lot of political patronage from the Directory, and Directory considered him as somebody who they can depend on for any kind of crisis. Fourth was his Italian campaign. So as I told you, कि जो Italy थी, Italy at that time was dominated by Austria, and as you know that French were fighting war against the Austria. So French thought that in order to weaken Austria, it's important that we remove the control of Austria over Italy. So Napoleon was sent to achieve this goal. Napoleon went to Italy, northern Italy, where Austria was dominating. He fought a war against them with very limited army. The army was much less compared to the army of Austria, and he defeated them. And that was a very big surprise because everybody expected that French will be defeated. So he defeated Austria, and Austria had to sign an agreement where Austria recognized the dominance of French over the northern Italy. Right? So ultimately that war made him a national hero, because as you know, उससे पहले France was getting defeated in every war it was fighting. So this victory in the Italian campaign made him a national hero and made him somebody who was worshipped by the French people. He has brought back the national pride of France. So after the Italian campaign, he got a popular support, and he also got a lot of financial resources from the Directory. Fifth was the weakness of Directory, as I told you. There was no mass support, there was economic crisis. Sixth was his Egyptian campaign. So basically 1798 में Egypt was dominated by British. Now, French thought that if they will get access to Suez Canal or if they get access to that route, so they can reach easily to India. Plus, French wanted to increase their national self-confidence, and therefore they thought of challenging the British. Napoleon was settled, as I've said, he was the go-to-go guy for the French. He went there, and he went there with not just himself. He also took a lot of scientists, lot of architecture experts, lot of historians, lot of literary men to France. And he fought a war against the British, but he was defeated by the British Navy because, as I've told you, Britain always had a very powerful navy. So he was defeated by the British Navy. Okay? After the defeat, he was defeated, but ultimately, because he brought all these men of intellect to Egypt, it started what we call as a significant study on Egyptology, because those historians who went there, they started studying the history of Egypt, and that's how जो Egyptology है वो इतनी ज़्यादा significant बनी. Thus, even though Napoleon was defeated, he created a kind of propaganda in France, and it was a civilizational mission for him. Right? It was not a war. He did not went there to fight the battle. Rather, he went there to ultimately civilize those people, and he was successful in that. Right? So even this defeat, increased his prestige and image in the French. Significance of PR, yes. And finally, the final reason behind the rise of Napoleon was the popular desire for order and stability. They were fed up. 10 years of anarchy, 10 years of violence, 10 years of economic instability. If we talk about Germany, how Hitler rose, similar to that, कुछ ऐसे ही हालात फ्रांस में भी. उन्होंने कहा ठीक है हमें चाहिए था revolution. But now we want stability. Now we want strong government. Now we want political stability. Now we want a person who can take strong decisions so that we can be out of this mess. Right? And Napoleon, who was already a national hero, a strong man, person who was highly nationalist and who could restore the order, people started looking towards him. And he has realized that he has become very powerful and he has become very popular in France. And he used this opportunity and he launched a coup against the Directory on, and that is called as the coup of 18 Brumaire. Reason being Brumaire, revolutionary calendar जो था French Revolution का, उसमें November was called as Brumaire. That is why it was called as coup of 18 Brumaire. And through that coup, Napoleon snatched power and he replaced Directory with a consulate. Consulate was technically a body of 3 people, 3 executives. इसमें 3 लोग थे, and these 3 people will share the executive power equally. उसमें first estate जो first council था, that was Napoleon. But over the years, in next few years, Napoleon concentrated all his powers in his hand, and जो बाकी 2 consulate थे, उनके पास कोई खास power नहीं. जो legislative body थी, that was kept very weak, and the major power was under the hand of consulate, and within that consulate, the major concentrated in the hands of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now let's understand, once Napoleon is in power, how did he consolidate his power? What steps did he take to consolidate his power? In this direction, Napoleon understood that I will have to create allies. If I have to stay for a longer period of time, I have to create allies. And one such ally that he created was the Pope, because he knew that French Revolution में काफी ज़्यादा excess हुआ है with the Catholic people and also with the priest. And he knew that still, even after the French Revolution, a significant part of French population is devout Catholic. And in order to win their confidence, it's important to sign an agreement with the Pope, because Pope was the spiritual leader of all the Catholics in the world. So therefore, he signed an agreement with Pope Pius VII, and that is called as the Concordat, which is also, it also means agreement. And under the agreement, Napoleon said that religion will be recognized as the religion of majority, and it will have special status in the French Republic. Okay? And he also said that जो भी mistreatment हुआ है with the priest and the church, I will reverse all that policy, and there will be no mistreatment from now on with the church and the priest. So that was the concordat he signed with the Pope. अब इसके provisions क्या थे? इसके provisions थे कि in terms of religion, Catholicism is recognized as the religion of the majority, but it was not made the state religion. The country remained secular. Similarly, church ने accept कर लिया कि जो उसके land confiscate हो गए थे, अब वो land उसको वापस नहीं मिलेंगे. Bishops जो थे, they will be appointed by Napoleon, but it will be finally approved by the Pope. So a middle ground was found. Ultimately, Pope will have the final say. Pope will have the veto power over the appointment of the bishops. Clergy की बात करें, so they will be paid salary by the French state, and clergy had to swear loyalty to the new French state. So a middle ground was found where some power was given back to them and some power kept with the state. Second step he took to consolidate his power was the historic Napoleonic Code. Napoleon ने basically 1804 में Napoleonic Code किया, and this code was used by various countries in the world, and it is still being used in various countries in Africa. तो पहली बार इस Napoleonic Code में कुछ revolutionary चीजें हैं, जैसे equality before law. Equality before law आया, प्लस इससे पहले क्या था कि फ्रांस में हर 20-30 किलोमीटर में अलग लॉ चलता था, अलग कोड चलता था, अलग प्रॉपर्टी लॉज थे, ठीक है ना? लेकिन Napoleonic Code ने क्या किया कि पूरे फ्रेंच एम्पायर में एक जैसा लीगल सिस्टम एस्टैब्लिश किया. अब जब एक जैसा लीगल सिस्टम स्टैब्लिश होगा तो इसके इनडायरेक्ट कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस भी होते हैं। वो क्या होंगे कि अल्टीमेटली सेम लॉ रहेगा तो इकोनॉमी को भी बेनिफिट होगा, ट्रेड को भी बेनिफिट होगा, क्योंकि ऐसा नहीं होगा कि हर एक 20 किलोमीटर पे अलग टैक्स पे करना पड़ रहा है आपको, ठीक है ना। सिमिलरली इट आल्सो हैड प्रोविजन फॉर मेरिट बेस्ड एडवांसमेंट, कि देयर विल बी नो एडवांसमेंट बेस्ड ऑन बर्थ, बट your advancement in every field of the government will be based on merit and not on the basis of. And third, it provided. Fourth, it established, abolished all the feudal privileges, established property rights, and that is also something which was revolutionary. Third step he took to centralize his power was, or to consolidate his power was, centralization of state power. So what he did was, he established a very efficient bureaucracy. He called it as auditor system, auditor. He called it as auditor. And ultimately, people, at least in the initial years, the people who were appointed in administration, they were appointed based on merit, and they were directly responsible to Napoleon, right? And also, he established the Bank of France, which was kind of the Reserve Bank of France, which established or which printed currency. Plus, he established a uniform taxation system throughout the French Empire. Fourth, after 5 years, Napoleon said, enough is enough. I also want to be an emperor. So he proclaimed or declared himself as the emperor of the French. So 1799 से 1804 तक, या 1790 से लेके 1804 तक, there was a French Republic. But that Republic, 1804, when Napoleon crowned himself as the emperor of France. So जो I think Siddharth you said, कि how French Empire, the reason why French Empire was created because Napoleon crowned himself as king in 1804. And after becoming the king, he extended through the frequent wars. He extended the territory of France, and finally by 1812, when he reached its peak, most of Europe from Spain to Poland were under the control of Napoleon. So if we talk about his fifth policy through which he consolidated his rule was continental system, 1806. Even Napoleon realized he almost all the Europe. But then there are two important countries that are remaining outside his control. And among them, the most important and the most developed was Britain. Because Russia was a weak, it was an inefficient, or it was a medieval kind of a society by then. But England में industrial revolution हो रहा था उस टाइम पे, जिसके बारे में हम कल के लेक्चर में जानेंगे. और ब्रिटेन जो था वो एक बहुत ही डेवलप्ड और बहुत ही प्रोग्रेसिव, बहुत ही पावरफुल स्टेट था. Now Napoleon realized this thing कि his dream of becoming the emperor of whole Europe can never be realized till he does not capture Britain. But at that moment, he realized that he is not in the position to capture Britain, but he is in the position to at least weaken Britain economically. Because he knew that if Britain will be weakened economically, Britain will also become weak politically. Because Britain was the biggest trader during that time. अगर उसकी economic power तो उसकी political और military power भी धीरे-धीरे collapse होगी, and in future Napoleon will be able to capture Britain. So for that, he launched the continental system by two decrees, the Berlin Decree and the Milan Decree. Through the Berlin Decree, he said कि कोई भी, he banned the British ships from entering European ports under the French control. And as you know, most of the continental Europe was under the French. So most of the European ports were closed for British ships. Through the Milan Decree, he extended the blockade to neutral countries also. Not just those countries who were under the control or who were the allies of Britain, France, even those countries जो कि neutral थी, Napoleon ने कहा कि वो भी, your port can also cannot entertain a British ship. So technically it was kind of an economic blockade that he launched against the Britain. But that blockade failed, continental system failed, and it made Napoleon enemy of many neutral states also. So basically, UK ने इसको कैसे change किया? UK ने कहा कि ठीक है, if we can't trade with Europe, we will trade with America. So ultimately, because Britain की navy was always stronger, right? So it could still trade with America and countries of Africa and Asia. So जितना Napoleon ने सोचा था कि उनको economic effect होगा, नहीं हुआ. Secondly, it economically hurted many European countries, right? Because ultimately it led to a widespread discontentment against them. जो countries फायदा में थी ब्रिटेन से ट्रेड करने से, उनका ट्रेड रोक दिया गया. So there was a kind of discontentment that arose in those countries that were under the French rule. Similarly, it also kind of alienated the neutral countries. For example, Russia, which was a neutral country, Russia did not adhere to the continental policy of Napoleon, and they continued to trade with Britain. But that was not liked by Napoleon, and Napoleon therefore attacked Russia. And we will discuss in a bit about the Russian campaign of Napoleon. Okay? So continental system was one of the reasons behind his downfall. Now let's look into the downfall of Napoleon. 1815 Napoleon was defeated and he was sent in exile to St. Helena. So what were the factors behind the downfall of Napoleon? The first factor was Peninsular War. So as we know, as if you see the map under his empire, तो हम देख पा रहे हैं कि Kingdom of Spain was under the control of France and Portugal was not under the control of France. ठीक है? तो अब स्पेन में नेपोलियन ने कॉन्टिनेंटल सिस्टम अप्लाई किया, बट स्पेन का काफी ज्यादा ट्रेड जो था, स्पेन का काफी ज्यादा जो ट्रेड था वो ब्रिटेन के साथ था, ठीक है ना, और प्लस पोर्चुगल पूरी तरीके से ब्रिटेन का ट्रेड कर रहा था. तो नेपोलियन इंटरवीन इन स्पेन एंड पोर्चुगल टू इन्फोर्स द कॉन्टिनेंटल सिस्टम, बट स्पेनिश पीपल स्पेशली द स्पेनिश नेशनलिस्ट डिड नॉट लाइक दिस इंटरवेंशन, बिकॉज उनको लगा कि यार ये चीज तो बहुत ज्यादा गलत है कि आप हमको क्यों बता रहे हो कि हमें क्या करना है. सो अ लॉट ऑफ these Spanish nationalists, they transformed themselves into guerrillas and they launched guerrilla warfare against the French army, and that resulted in a lot of loss of money. It led to loss of troops, and it also ultimately created a lot of financial constraint for the French, and that is what we call as the Spanish ulcer, right? Because ultimately he got too much involved in Spain. Second reason behind his downfall was Russian invasion. अब रशिया बेसिकली क्या हुआ कि रशिया को कैप्चर करना इज इम्पॉसिबल. जो गलती हिटलर ने करी थी वर्ल्ड वॉर 2 में, हम 4th लेक्चर में आएंगे, वही गलती नेपोलियन ने भी करी 1812. He thought that Russia, who was not adhering to continental blockade policy of Napoleon, it has to be taught a lesson. It has to be taught a lesson. And as you know, Russia was backward and medieval, and Napoleon thought, how will this weak Russia will be a match to us? So therefore, he invaded Russia with a grand army of 600,000 to 6 lakh people. Now रशिया की स्ट्रेटजी क्या थी कि भाई ठीक है आने दो, क्योंकि रशिया वाज सो बिग, तो उसको पता कि जब तक तुम मॉस्को तक पहुंचोगे तब तक तो विंटर आ जाएगी और फिर तुम्हारी बैंड बजेगी. सो व्हाट दे डिड वाज दे डिड अ स्ट्रेटेजिक रिट्रीट. वो क्या करते थे कि वो गांव के गांव खाली कर देते थे और गांव के गांव चला देते कि तुम जब आओगे गांव में तुमको ना खाने को मिलेगा ना रहने को मिलेगा, ठीक है ना, एंड यू हैव टू फेस दिस चिली विंटर ऑफ रशिया. बाय द टाइम French army had reached Moscow, they were exhausted. There was French winters जो आ गई थी और उनके पास उस winters को झेलने के लिए now, and they were not prepared for that harsh winter, right? And there was lack of supply that was coming because maximum गांव जो थे Russians ने जला दिए. So ultimately, because of this, only 1 lakh people came back. 5 lakh soldiers either died or they were captured by the Russians. So that led to a severe loss of men, moral and prestige, and it also gave this confidence to other European powers that Napoleon is not invincible. He can be defeated. Right, so after this Russian invasion, it resulted in formation of allies in Europe. So next step was the rise of European nationalism. With the defeat of France in Russia, nationalist feelings emerged in Spain, Germany, and Italy, and they said, we are being ruled by French, and they are imposing their rule on us. So ultimately, we have to resist this foreign rule, and that led to the development of Grand Coalition to defeat Napoleon. Right, इसमें Russia थी, which is northern Germany, Austria था और Britain. All of them formed a grand coalition, and ultimately they thought that together we can defeat Napoleon. तो finally क्या हुआ कि Battle of Leipzig में, जो कि जर्मनी में है, it is called as Battle of Nations because almost all the Europe fought. और इस battle में World War 1 से पहले तक सबसे ज्यादा लोग fight किए थे. That is why it is called as Battle of Nations, because many countries were directly or indirectly participated in the war. So in that war, Napoleon was defeated. German states who were earlier the French ally, they had abandoned the French alliance. इसके बाद after the defeat at Leipzig, these allies or these allies of yours, they felt more confident and they thought that we can also defeat France. So they invaded France and Paris was captured and Napoleon was exiled to Elba, which was a small island. अब हुआ क्या कि after this defeat, the allies they had instilled on throne the grandson of Louis XVI, Louis XVIII. But in Elba, Napoleon was not satisfied. He escaped from the prison. He came back to France and he again became the king. And after he again became the king, the European powers, they again united and they again fought against Napoleon in the Battle of Waterloo, which is in Belgium. And in that Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon was defeated very, very comprehensively. And finally, he was exiled permanently to St. Helena, which is an island in Atlantic Ocean. And he left and he lived his remaining life in St. Helena and he died as a lonely man few years later. This was the story of Napoleon. Now, if we talk about Napoleon, what were the reforms that were brought by Napoleon? The first reform was that he established the Bank of France, plus tax collection was centralized, plus corruption was reduced, and guilds who were inefficient, they were also abolished. Similarly, first time that happened in France, the industrial committee was established, and that committee looked into disputes between the laborers and the merchants. Similarly, if we talk about the education reforms of Napoleon, he established what we call as lycées. Lycees were technically secondary school, they were military schools, and they used to focus on mathematics, science, history, and military training, and they were directly controlled by the state. Okay? And this Lycée schools, they used to train the future civil servants and officers. Similarly, he established University of France in 1808. He also established a teacher training center, and he also established vocational schools for people who were not gifted academically, so that in these vocational schools they can learn the skills and they can become small merchants. With respect to the socio-cultural reforms, Napoleon established a policy of conciliation with emigrants and non-Jews. ये लोग कौन थे? ये वो लोग थे जो लोग anti-revolutionary थे. So these people who were anti-revolution, they were treated in a good manner by Napoleon, because and that was something which was very rarely known at that time. ठीक है ना? Similarly, Napoleon ensured कि offices were open to all. कोई भी आदमी है, they can actually become a high-ranking official. Plus, he also signed the Concord as we have seen, and finally he stopped the brigandage. What is brigandage? Brigandage was highway robbery that was very prevalent, especially during the 10 years of French Revolution. So many merchants were looted, and because of that, trade suffered badly. So with strict implementation of law and order, he stopped the brigandage, which boosted trade in France. With respect to the politico-administrative reforms, as I told you, he created a new civil service called as auditor, right? He also established perfects, in each department. Perfects were equivalent to secretary that we see in the government. And these perfects, they were responsible to the Napoleon. So his centralized rule